Now let's get down to some of what I think a lot of people are interested. It's time for buy and sell. How do we negotiate the deal? Where do we go with this? I'm going to start with Sean. What are the key observations that you come across when you're creating the buy-sell agreements with a family business?
Yeah, the biggest one is when I'm dealing with a family business owner and I say, can I take a look at your buy and sell agreement? You'd be surprised at how many times that, the buy and sell agreement that was created 15, 20 years ago when the business was much smaller, it was just less complex and it is completely out of date. And then you have to say, whoa, we need to take a look at this again and talk to their attorney. If their attorney's not up to the task, find someone like Steve and have them go through it and actually get something that's doable.
John, I'm curious because my family is invested in something where there is an exit plan. I know how the buy-sell plays out. How often do you come across a situation where that just doesn't exist at the firm you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty common. I think a lot of businesses don't necessarily have something off the shelf to leverage, and I think that's why it's really important to have really strong legal counsel and a legal advisor, is to make sure that you're covered in the buy-sell agreement. And even, from the investor perspective, I often view a term sheet or an LOI, once it's accepted, as the beginning of a negotiation, not the end of it, because once you get into, the nitty-gritty of the definitive documentation, just the mechanics of how things work can be really detailed and complex, and you got to make sure you're covered.
Stephen, I'm going to ask you to put on different hats during this discussion. I'm the family business. I'm at the table. You're representing me as the family business. I've got Sean and John at the table. We realize that the buy-sell agreement is out of date. What's the next step?
Well, we'll have to negotiate the principal terms. So if John's coming in for an investment, the question is, what type of investment is it? It's minority investment. Majority investment will dictate what kind of terms we'd like. So for instance, if John is an investor and at some point he wants the ability to sell his investment, we would want the ability to tag along with John so we can exit and have liquidity at the same time he is. Conversely, John may say, and by the way, that's so-called tag along. Conversely, John may say, hey, if I want to sell, I want liquidity, I have the right to drag you along. So even if you don't want to sell, I've said it's time to sell and we're going to sell. Now, when you do that and what the minimum floors are is all the subject of negotiation, but it's a detailed negotiation. I mean, the buy-sell is a tough document, and that's why, frankly, I see a lot of business partners kind of avoid it, but it really does save a lot of headache. I mean, a lot of headache. It's no cure.
In those kinds of situations, Stephen, could one of the original partners throw a wrench into a potential deal, or is it dependent upon the original structure of the agreement?
Yeah, it's exactly the latter, right? So there are shareholder agreements where there might be a right of first refusal or right of buyout. So, and that, getting back to diligence, that's one of the key documents you want to look at and say, all right, if I want to sell this business, what do I need to do? What hurdles do I have? And you find out some partner has a right of first refusal. That's something you need to address before you go out to market. And it's not uncommon.
Sean, without, betraying any trust or names, have you experienced this in your negotiations?
From time to time, and what Steve alluded to is also, in terms of the protections for shareholder rights, it's amazing when you come across that and it's just not adequate. And that's a huge red flag that just shows there's just not an equitable trust going back and forth.
Lami, what about you? We were talking about due diligence. I would imagine that's part of the prep to come to the table, or is it not? Looking at a buy-sell agreement.
Right. Yeah, the buy-sell agreement. Usually, it's something we would have to look at as well, and not just that. When there's an actual transaction, the purchase and sale agreement would need to have strong legal terms, and that's where Farrell Fritz will come in terms of making sure some of the provisions like the MAC, the Material Adverse Clause, is inserted. We had a lot of issues last year with people trying to kind of get out of their deal because of COVID. So, having things tighten up is very crucial. From my perspective, I try to make sure that everything is has the right financial terms, like is it according to GAAP, making sure some of the definitions are included from a working capital standpoint. Again, just trying to echo all the terms of the agreement.
Steve, I'm curious, based on what Lami just said, have you seen a big uptick in adverse event clause disputes because of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, the clause has been refined now. So essentially, you want a buyer and seller, right? Both acknowledge we're in a COVID environment. So if I'm selling to you today, I don't want you to walk away before, when we're at the closing table because you say there's been a material adverse change due to COVID. Where you end up is something that the effects of COVID somehow is greater for that particular company than it is industry-wide. So you can make it a particular effect. But it's, honestly has not been an issue in the number of deals I've done since COVID.
When you're negotiating these deals and you're the lawyer, I'm going to assume now you represent the seller. Does the seller dictate the terms in this case, or is it a mutual negotiation? How does that work?
Yeah, so typically the buyer does the first draft of the agreement. So they're asking for the terms that they want the sale to be on, but ultimately it's a negotiation. So, a lot of it is within, a kind of standard negotiating parameters, and you just have to slog through it. But it's just a matter of leverage. So who's going to dictate the terms? Who really wants the deal more?
James, have you seen this arise when your CIOs are working with a mid-market firm?
I absolutely have. And one thing that we've seen a lot here in New York, there's something called the New York Shield Act, which a lot of mid-sized businesses don't know about, but it details the parameters on keeping your data sets secure, your employee data sets, your customer data sets. And in many of these agreements, you'll see a compliance in the buy-sell agreement to the New York Shield Act. Our CIOs know what that is. They know the systems you need to have in place to meet the bar for compliance. And so there is an IT component that comes in here around things like customer data security in the New York Shield Act. So absolutely we have. And some sellers balk at it. Some buyers don't know what it is, but we're there to help them. As Lami said, we're on their side.
Let me go to the money side of this, both John and Sean. I'll start with you, John. Is there key bullet points that you would want the people listening to know about what you're looking for as an investor in the agreement?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, from our perspective at Origami, especially, Stephen had mentioned this earlier, I believe, we're typically a non-control investor. So something that we're typically focused on is just ensuring that we're able to get liquidity on the position and on our investment. So we often will try to work a put right into the agreement. And also, as Sean, I think, had mentioned earlier, just having good minority shareholder protections. So, value can't be siphoned off and some of those things, not to say that they obviously would, but just to make sure all bases are covered. Those are things that are typically really important to us and of a key focus.
Sean, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't, underline enough the shareholder protection, even for people who are on the other side. I say, look, if you don't have the shareholder protection in there, it can be very offensive to the other side, and you can just walk away. So make it as robust as you possibly can.
Stephen, I want to recap some of what we've said are key elements of these agreements. Can you go through that? And I realize it's legal terms, but this is where rubber meets the road.
Yeah, so I mean, the way to think about it, and a lot of business owners will say to me, what's the process here? I want to sell my company, but I don't really understand what the process is. And so very quickly, it's simply, you get some non-disclosure agreements out to prospective buyers. You get some indication of interest from those buyers after they've received some preliminary kind of high-level financial information. And then you dialogue with the one who seems to have an indication of interest at a value that you think is something you can execute at. And if that indeed is the case, you'll end up with a letter of intent that sets forth the principal terms of the transaction. sets forth a due diligence period and an exclusivity period during which you agree only to work with this particular buyer. Now, once the letter of intent is executed, you have your purchase and sale agreement, which clearly just sets forth the economic terms of the transaction. But the heart of it is the buyer ensuring that it gets the benefit of its bargain. So it's going to ask the seller to make these representations and warranties we've been talking about. Compliance with law, accurate financial statements, all permits and licenses, good IT systems, data security. And the import of not making a accurate or truthful rep is that post-closing, the seller needs to make the buyer whole for any losses the buyer incurs due to a breach of rep. So if you said all your assets are free and clear of liens and encumbrances, post-closing, the buyer has to pay $50,000 to clear a lien on an asset. Seller is going to cough up $50,000 plus expenses.
And just one last question on this topic. A letter of intent, if it doesn't have in there the words non-binding, is it then binding?
It's great for the lawyers, great for my litigators. So you be certain about it, be explicit. And 90% of the time they're non-binding, they should be non-binding. If they're binding, then you need to put all the protections that are in the full purchase and sale agreement. So that's a great point. Make sure even your term sheets that you're shuffling back and forth should say non-binding for discussion purposes only. You don't have a deal until you have a deal, and that's a purchase and sale agreement.
Okay. I'm going to say thank you. I appreciate all of you being here. And remember, this is just the first of several in a series that are going to take place this year on private equity. And we look forward to seeing you all again. So I'll see you there.